Hello everybody, welcome to the stream. Most of you may know me, but for the ones who don't, my name is Ian Jackson. I'm a recent college graduate and I have an extreme passion for music and creating it. What you're about to hear is my first major composition project. For those of you who were brought here via the Crisis Response Unit Insta page and or my personal Insta page, you would have seen this poster. Now, most of you probably said to yourself, what is this? I know this dude, but I have no idea what I'm looking at. And that is a completely normal response. That's why I have this introduction here, to explain more about this project before we dive into it. Destiny is a video game franchise. The first game released in 2014, and its sequel, Destiny 2, released in 2017. These are what you would call live service games, which means that content is added to them on a regular basis to keep the game feeling fresh and not becoming stale. This happens to be my most played game ever. Although it's not my favorite, there's something about this world that keeps me coming back to it. Its unique blend of science fiction and fantasy, two genres that would typically clash together, are interwoven in such a natural way that I feel cannot be replicated anywhere else. As for the music in this franchise, it's some of the best there is. The triumphant heroic tracks, to wonder and mystery, to heavy, oppressive, dominating pieces that can't help but make you feel anxious. The music team for Destiny and Destiny 2 have always brought their A game. While I do believe that there isn't a single bad song in either game's soundtracks, I do think there is one section in particular that's underwhelming, and that leads us to Spire the Watcher. In Destiny 2, there are different levels of activities that you can play. Generally, playing higher difficulty activities grants you stronger gear to tackle bigger challenges, which then give you stronger gear, and I'm sure you understand it by now. Spire of the Watcher is among these higher difficulty activities. With a special theme, this dungeon grants gear with a Western appearance. I mean, just look at this cowboy hat. Who wouldn't want that? I use that regularly. Anyway, the objective here is to eliminate the Vex. I kid you not, time-traveling robots from outer space. You do this by basically being an electrician and activating all of these nodes hidden around the area to progress to the next zone. And in some cases, you need to activate these in order to make a particular enemy vulnerable. But you'll see that in action later. So musically, how do we communicate a Western theme while also fitting in with electricity and time-traveling robots? Well, from what it seems, you almost completely ignore the Western aspect entirely. At least that's what the in-game tracks sound like. And to me, that was incredibly disappointing. There is a single moment with a guitar that lasts for about 10 seconds before completely disappearing for the rest of the activity. So I figured I would take matters into my own hands and fix this issue, going as far as learning the guitar, among some other instruments that I'll keep as a surprise. Hopefully, listeners can discern the Western elements while not feeling out of place with its digital counterparts. And to be clear, I'm not at all trying to one-up the artists who made the original tracks for the game. That is not my intention here. I just want to dramatically evolve the Western aspect in the music. So, now that the formalities are out of the way, please sit back and enjoy a musical reimagining of Destiny 2's Spire of... Okay, that's a mouthful. I think I have something a little bit better.
An old acquaintance among the hidden tells me that a Seraph complex recently powered on for the first time since the collapse. Shortly thereafter, Vex incursions were reported. Anna flagged the site as a potential pillory bunker. If the Vex gain access to its systems, they'll use it to wrest Rasputin's submine data away from us. It would be catastrophic. At the source of the complex's spark supply. Centuries in Martian rust have done this place no kindness. Our window of opportunity is short. Arc surges destabilize the complex, and Vex are breaching the command matrix. No. They were rivals in the Golden Age. This wasn't just a pillory site, it was a joint research facility, focused on extrasolar colonization efforts. The Sol Divisive have been scouring research logs. They were looking for something more than to imprison Rasputin's subminds. Information stored here, but could it be linked to my visions? Why else would the witness be interested in these files? complex mine remains in this terminal like an open door. It's using the tower's arrays to connect with installations across Seoul. This must be in preparation to imprison the submarines. Breaking their connection could end this threat. Get to the reactor, lest we lose everything. sabotage us, glean knowledge, and annihilate any trace of advantage. Extrasolar colonies. Ages ago, Saint and I thought we'd leave the city once we'd made it safe, but explore the universe. That time never came. A matter of finite seconds lost in the margins then. Now, there's only the one to know. But we learn to make do, young wolf, and turn the edge of defeat into victory.
And there you go. If you made it to the end, thanks for sticking around with me. It really does mean a lot that people like you are willing to support an independent artist like myself. If you are curious about the original tracks within the game, I would recommend checking out Dead Star Music's channel. They do an amazing job of cataloging many tracks within the Destiny franchise, and they have a video dedicated to everything within Spire the Watcher. If this video gets enough traction, or if people are just curious, I might upload a video showcasing what my Ableton file looks like. But for now, your viewership is always enough for me. Thank you, and I'll see you Starside.